Welcome to Medical Moral. This is the first lecture, Healthcare Ethics, Ethos, and Moral Agency. Now, all I'm trying to do is set the tone for exactly what we'll be studying in this course. So when we talk about ethics and how it relates to medical ethics, particularly, ethics, it really entails all those things, and by that I mean the attitudes, the behaviors, the actions, anything that affects the good of the human person and the community. So what's important is that ethics, is not something just simply what to do, or nor is it simply like what affects the individuals. It's really based on the dignity and the characters that are genuinely good for the human person, which begs the question, then what exactly is it that it is good for the human person? Nonetheless, it's also in the community and all our shared environment. So when we speak of the type of persons we are, that's a little bit different than just to determine what it is that we're doing. When we say, who are we as moral agents, we're really asking the question about what does it mean to be a good moral person. And so this being and this doing, it's really something that entails every aspect of our life. There's not too much that's going to be neutral in regards to this. So we'll soon see that determining ourselves as ethical persons, it's not an accumulation of exterior acts, because our intents and our motivation, that all matters. The fact that it's often private doesn't really change the ethical quality of our being and doing, simply because nobody else can see it. That all affects, quite frankly, who we are, and we could say that it affects our being. So there's a connection here between the doing and being. But the being has to do with something who we are as individuals, and the doing is often what we see as the exterior acts. So a person's character is not determined simply by the last good or the bad act. Quite frankly, our character is something earned, and it's developed over time. So we might be able to put it in this terms that to live well is an art. And the sad truth is most people really don't think too much about building their character and being a virtuous person. And part of the reason is there's no really clear markers to show incremental progress. If we were to simply try to say, how are we doing financially, we have very clear, typically external markers that are going to tell us how well we're doing. Perhaps even in your academic career, there are grades and such that are going to determine just how well things are going. But when it comes to being a good person, that's something that's quite interior, and it's not always going to be exteriorly known. In other words, many people simply could be brown-nosing to get ahead, whether that's in school or in work, and nobody would know that. All you see is the promotion and you see the pay increase, but that doesn't really tell us who the individual was. So if we talk further about, then what are some of the requirements? And that may not be the best term, but what are some of the requirements for us to be ethical people, or to even say to do ethics? Two of those are freedom and knowledge. Now, it's true that freedom involves a choice, right? Because the reality is that without us able to make a free choice, we really can't be held culpable. In other words, there could be no guilt if we are forced into something. Even in legal matters, that comes into account if a person has been under duress when they did something and such. But it's a determination of what we will or will not do. So we're choosing this and not choosing that. Now, that's an aspect of freedom, but that's more of a freedom that lacks restraint. And we would maybe call that a freedom of autonomy. And it's important, but it's not the only freedom, and it may not even be the, let's say, the freedom that's closer to what we would say is a moral freedom. There's also a type of freedom that we can say is the self-determination. So it doesn't involve a choice or an action per se, but this is a choice or an action only in terms of who do we want to be. So we have to start thinking in terms of goals, what they would normally say a telos, a teleological approach. And what that means is you work backwards. So when you were in high school, especially the dreaded junior year, you were trying to make very careful decisions so that besides your SATs, Your college application would look good, right? You made certain that you perhaps were in a club or an officer, and that you were giving your time volunteering somewhere, so that you can put that down as community service and such. You also knew what to avoid. Make sure that there were certain things that you did not do that could harm your chances to get into a particular college. So you worked backwards, trying to say, this is my goal and this is what I need to do and how I need to act in order to get there. Now, that's good, but we're trying to do that with just being ethical persons. And again, it has to go back to this idea that there's no clear marker that's going to really tell us. It's only in the end is it all going to seem worth it for us. Maybe a good example to use here would be marriage. People often don't look at the end. In other words, I'd like to be married at least 50 or 60 years. That's what I want to celebrate my anniversary, God willing that we have long and healthy lives. So we don't try to see how do I get there. We only look at like how we may feel now and what we may see now as a particular desire or choice that we want to make. But if we always made those choices in terms of I want to reach that goal, then we would have a different self-determining, let's say, choice of behavior and choice of words and all those various things. But we would make it our goal to not put ourselves in a situation or don't do anything that could lead to a harm within our marriage and obviously a divorce. In the same way that when you were a junior in high school, you made sure you didn't do certain things that could derail your chances to get into the school that you want. So these things are all self-determining freedoms, and they're very important. But there's one other freedom that I want to add to what the text talked about, and let's call this freedom of excellence. Now, this is like a freedom of self-determination, but here, and I'm going to give you a good definition of freedom that I want you to remember as we move through this course. Freedom should be understood as the ability to do that which you were designed to do. In other words, it follows whatever the design of something is, and the closer you get to working within that design, then therefore it's freer to use. Let me give you an example. So I can use a pen to write on paper. I can make sure that I don't, jam it when I'm clicking it and such and such. And if I use the pen in the way that it's designed, hopefully I'll have a nice long life and I'll be free to use it when I am writing. If I used it to, say, dig out the weeds or such between the cracks in a concrete sidewalk, it would do that, but I would also damage it. It would not be using the pen in a way that it was designed to do. Therefore, I will not have the freedom to use the pen to do that which it was designed to do. Now, if there's a design to the human person, a nature, which is an argument that I'll make in another lecture, then the closer we can get to our own design, the freer that we are. Now, in morality, that sounds a little vague, and it sounds like it's a little subjective. But think in terms of your physical health. There are certain things that we do to try to stay healthy, or at least we know what those things would be in order for us to remain healthy. And we wouldn't consider it freedom to go against that. So we don't think that if we're supposed to, eat a certain way, avoid refined sugars, watch how many carbohydrates we take, try to get if we went down the line, we wouldn't see those things as rules, as an imposition on our freedom. We would say that those things are helping us to do what is best for our physiological design. So that's the type of freedom that I want to speak about here. All right. Now, when all of these things, as far as knowledge is concerned, specifically, requires reasoning and discernment. Those also are not things that are just self-evident. Not everybody is very good at reasoning. Not everybody is very good at discernment. These things take quite a bit of time, in some regards, to work out and such. So what we do is the reasoning is really a reflection that's necessary for building this quality of the self and also our actions. Now, when we were younger, we may have simply done something because of an authority. We were told to do it. Don't play in the street or you'll get hurt. Study hard and you'll learn, etc. But as we matured, that why began to form. So the why then, that's the reasoning that's necessary for judgments. And discernment, you could almost understand that as a weighing of the options. as we try to determine the goal that we want to achieve. Now, we're going to apply all of this as we move through the course to medical ethics, but our understandings of freedom and knowledge is going to directly, have bearing on how we make ethical choices. Now, there's various ethics that one can study. What we will study and what typically is being studied in these courses is normative ethics. Now, that's different than what is known as descriptive ethics. Descriptive ethics just describe the situation, no more than what it says. The music is loud. There's no real ethical quality involved in that. But if we say that music is loud and therefore disruptive, the loud is the information, and knowledge is, that people have sensibility to loud music, and it's, not, say, kind to blast music when other people may not enjoy our particular taste. So those judgments, then, we have to consider how this music volume that we're playing, how does it affect other people? And the discernment is, perhaps I should not play music loud. It's really inconsiderate. So the ethical act, then, is to turn down the volume when in the presence of others. So that's the doing. That's what people see, that we are turning down the volume. But the fact that we don't want to be inconsiderate people, or that we consider other people with our actions, so we don't want to play music that's too loud, that's really the being of who we are, and then the doing will follow being. So we all may know people that will do things, regardless of who they are. They seem to not be that type of person, but yet they do the right thing. Now that's one thing, because at least those individuals are following principles, but we're trying to get underneath all of that and talk about the being and having those qualities of character that allow us to do those things that are ethical. Now, as far as healthcare ethics, perhaps a good definition would be that healthcare ethics, is the structure, the organization, the delivery, and the relationships, including the means of how the administering of care will affect individuals and communal well-being. Then all what we have said, applies to this as a specialty. So we're going to take this whole concept of being and doing, and our freedom of knowledge, reasoning, and discernment and such, and apply it directly to the structure, organization, delivery, relationships, and means of administering this care, how it affects individuals, and how it affects communal well-being. So we're going to cover this in various ways of doing ethics in the upcoming weeks. But let's use a crass utilitarian approach here right now, just for an illustration, per se. In other words, the utilitarian approach is basically the end justifies the means. So we're in the middle right now, in the fall of 2020, trying to formulate a vaccination for COVID-19. If we said it's very important that we get one out as quickly as possible, you could do that by removing all ethical considerations, right? So scientists can do the human study subjects, but perhaps let's not tell anybody whether or not we were going to have a placebo class. In other words, there always has to be those in the placebo class, but let's not even bring that up. It's just one more layer of certainty that we can have. As far as side effects, we can't be concerned with that right now. Perhaps if we do have any concern with side effects, we can use poor people, or perhaps test subjects, or prisoners for that sake. And then once it's developed, it's really going to be in need. So this is also an opportunity to maximize our profit. So here you can imagine that the rich and the powerful are going to be perfectly fine in this scenario, and the poor and the disenfranchised, well, they'll be at their mercy. Now, we have enough examples of this throughout history that are real examples. So rules, and in this case, things that would govern human tests being done, particularly in developing vaccines, they've been done in a way that's going to allow us to not just do these things ethically, but also formed from the understanding that each person is trying to do their best while they're doing this, or I should say be their best would be a better way to put that, okay? In other words, we're going to look beyond just our own personal needs or our own personal advantages in this, which even those who just simply do what is good can still have the motivation for things that aren't necessarily ethical. But if we can get the people to themselves to be ethical, then we have more certainty that the things that they do will be good. Like, let me give you an example. This is a real short one. In 2017, Wells Fargo It was caught that they were giving internal memos to some of their employees that they should open up various bank accounts using just kind of like splitting bank account money, we should say. When there was an incentive for people to receive bonuses by, opening more bank accounts, they decided this was one way to do it. They even went further to sell life insurance and I think renter's insurance policies through Prudential. The employees would use their own home address, but they would use the actual bank account information from the customers. And their own home address was so that the customers would not find out about this. Now, there were a few individuals at Prudential that started to see this, and here was their dilemma now. Once they realized what was going on, unethical and illegal, they had to make a decision whether or not they were going to bring that to their employers. Now, the concern is that Wells Fargo is one of the biggest accounts for Prudential, so this could really have financial, underpinnings as far as what's going to happen for the stability of their division. Nonetheless, 3 people were brave and made the call and became whistleblowers, and all 3 of them lost their jobs. Now, you can't fire somebody for being a whistleblower, but the reality is in the workforce, you don't have to give anybody a reason why they're being fired. That's one of those things that sort of like an urban myth that, if you were fired, you should demand that you know why, and I'm not leaving until I do, and all you're going to find out is that, security will remove you. So these were people that had more of an ethical understanding of who they were and still wanted to do the right thing. Even though they knew they were going to put themselves in harm's way. For myself, if that were a relative of mine, quite frankly, I would call them my hero. But that being said, we have to start trying to look at ethics that it governs our being and our doing. But we're hoping that the ethical doing, the external things, flow from the actual being of who we are. Okay, something else to make a point about is that ethics is not the moral police. What I mean by that is that ethics is supposed to help in healthcare ethics is supposed to help the healthcare worker act more freely. Okay, so in the same way that a doctor would try to help an individual who's struggling with a particular, say, diabetes or such, with their diet to have a freer life, a more healthy life. Those aren't rules imposed on them, right? You wouldn't come home and say, I can't believe what this doctor told me to do. It's stupid. We would look for that as advice to help the individual live better physiologically. Well, the same thing here is with an ethics. So the ethicist is only there to help the healthcare worker do what they do better. So there's never sort of this tension that one's looking over the other's shoulders. There's always these perhaps checks, and if there's a situation that arises, then somebody could step in and say this is an issue, but there's not that relationship that's antagonistic between the two. So I just want to make certain that that's clear. It always is based in healthcare ethics on what we consider to be the genuine good for the human person. Now, this begs a lot of questions because when we say what is good for the human person, we're going to have to determine are there actual objective goods or is it just subjective goods based on our particular desires. Now, we're not going to iron that out here today, but we will in the next few weeks at least talk more about that and such. Nonetheless, we'll leave it there. Now, the last thing here is the ethical awareness. In other words, we're going to work through a lot of case studies in this course, and we're going to try then to apply ethical considerations to what is, quite frankly, complex scenarios. Our ethical radar should always be keen to also the not-so-complex actions in play in healthcare. So we're going to have to say what would be the overarching goal, and these are typically some of the listed as the 4 goals of healthcare as we apply our ethics to these various cases. So it's just well-being, prevention. Obviously, it's better to prevent a disease than to treat it. But once a person does have some sort of pathology, then alleviation, the 3rd goal, comes in, and to care for the individual. Now, I'm not expounding on these right now, but that last part is extremely important because healthcare workers never treat a disease and they never just have cases. They're always treating individuals. So the first and foremost thing that perhaps, would, as say, a semantic trick to help us make certain we're doing that is to always call this individual by their name, you know. So rather than say the patient in 302 or that the guy with diabetes, we're going to say Albert, that type of thing. All right. Now, these are known as the principles of healthcare. Now, this is going to be just like one of the ethical categories that we'll look over, if you want to call them approaches and such. But nonetheless, they have been developed over time, and they're worth mentioning here up front. So autonomy is that a person has the right to determine their own care. That means even to the extent that they could be irrational. Now, that doesn't mean that they could not have the facility, say the mental capacity, that's different. But if they choose, say, that I've been going through, say, dialysis for quite some time, and I'm old, I'm getting tired of this, and I want to stop dialysis, that may seem irrational to some of us, but respect for the individual, well, let's say respect for the individual's autonomy, that comes first. Now, this is an absolute, all right? So we cannot do something to some, or we cannot even allow something to be done to a person, particularly because they want it. A good, clear, though, and maybe a narrow example would be somebody who has, say, limb dysphoria. There are cases where an individual might say that their leg is not theirs. They see it as basically a foreign object attached to them, and they want it amputated. Well, there's no legitimate ethical means for that to happen. Often, tragically, they might take the whole situation in their own hands. But nonetheless, just because a person would ask that doesn't mean then that has to be honored. But this autonomy is based on human dignity, so it's an extremely important aspect. Beneficence, in other words, this comes back to doing good for what is the individual. Maleficence is that you're going to do no harm. Now, the last part, justice, this is going to have something, that it has to be just, not just for the individual, but also to be just for the community. And when we say what something is that is just, that doesn't just only mean, I should say, of what the person wants or desires. So we'll eventually get around to determining that justice is to give another their due, and that's all based, again, on what exactly is a goal for the individual. So in the last part, I just want to end with this, this whole concept of moral agency. An overarching goal is really to provide good care and overcome any obstacles to good practice. That's moral agency. That should be like an underlying ethos or like a worldview of the healthcare worker. And I'll repeat it. To provide good care and overcome any obstacles to good practice. So it's beneficial for the patient, because it facilitates better care, the recoveries for the whole person. But it's also beneficial for the healthcare professional because it builds up that person's competency and resilience so that they too can continue to do well in their profession. And it's best just to know that there's no ethical neutral position. We're always making choices typically that are either going to add to our ethical being and then therefore doing or detract from those. So we're going to have to keep in mind that, that regardless of the level of complexity, we're going to have to try to find a good way to make judgments.